In the unforgiving Montana Territory of 1867, a grizzled mountain hermit discovers a 6-year-old girl abandoned to die in the wilderness by the very people who should have protected her. As he nurses her back to life in his isolated cabin, both outcasts must face the vengeful men who left her for dead. But what terrible secret were they willing to murder a child to keep hidden? The gunshot echoed across Copper Ridge like thunder, sending ravens bursting from the pine trees in a black cloud of wings and warnings. Ezra Caldwell dropped to one knee behind a fallen log, his heart hammering as he scanned the forest below his cabin. In 15 years of living alone in these Montana mountains, he had never heard a rifle fired so close to his home. October wind bit through his wool coat as he waited, listening. The year was 1867, and the territory still crawled with dangers, claimed jumpers, horse thieves, and worse. His weathered hands gripped his own rifle tighter as silence settled back over the wilderness like a heavy blanket. Nothing moved except the yellow aspen leaves dancing in the breeze. Ezra rose slowly, his knees creaking like old leather. At 43, he felt every harsh winter in his bones. His gray beard caught snowflakes that had begun falling from the dark clouds gathering over the peaks. Winter came early this high up, and it stayed late. Probably just some fool hunter, he muttered. But something in his gut said different. Something felt wrong about that shot. Too close, too sharp, like it had been aimed at something important. He moved down the slope with the quiet steps of a man who had spent half his life tracking game through these hills. His boots found the soft spots between rocks, avoiding the dry branches that would snap and give him away. Behind him, his log cabin sat like a lonely island in a sea of pine and stone. The smell hit him first, gunpowder and something else, something that made his stomach turn over. He had smelled it before, during the war, when he was a different man, with a different name, in a different life. The metallic scent of blood. Ezra pushed through a thicket of wild roses, their thorns catching at his coat. On the other side, he found what the rifle had been aimed at. A wagon lay on its side in the narrow trail, one wheel still spinning slowly. Supplies scattered everywhere, flour sacks torn open, their white contents mixing with the dark earth. A water barrel leaked its precious cargo into the dirt. But no people, no horses, just empty harnesses cut clean through, as if someone had freed the animals in a hurry. Ezra knelt beside the wagon, reading the story written in the disturbed ground. Boot prints, horse hooves, and something else that made his blood run cold. Small bare feet, no bigger than his hand. A child's prints, heading up the mountain toward the thick forest where no child should ever go alone. "Hello?" he called softly, then louder. "Anyone there?" Only the wind answered, moaning through the rocks like a ghost. He followed the tiny footprints up the steep slope, his breathing coming harder in the thin mountain air. The tracks led him through stands of pines so thick they blocked out most of the gray sky. Here and there, he found scraps of yellow cloth caught on low branches, bright as sunshine against the dark bark. The prints grew fainter as the ground turned rocky. Twice he lost the trail completely and had to backtrack, searching for any sign of where the child had gone. His heart beat faster with each passing minute. Night came quick in the mountains, and it came cold. A child alone up here would not see morning. He found her just as the first fat snowflakes began to stick to the ground. She lay curled under a lightning-struck pine, its massive trunk split and blackened by some long-ago storm. At first glance, she looked like a pile of rags someone had thrown away. But then he saw the rise and fall of her small chest, slow and weak but still fighting. "Sweet Jesus," Ezra whispered, dropping his rifle and falling to his knees beside her. She could not have been more than 6 years old. Her auburn hair hung in tangles around a face pale as fresh snow. The yellow dress that had left pieces of itself on the trail was now torn and dirty, offering little protection against the mountain cold. Her lips had turned blue, and her small hands were curled into fists so tight he could not pry them open. But she was alive. Ezra shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her tiny frame. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. When he lifted her, her head rolled against his shoulder, and he felt the fever burning through her skin. "What happened to you, little one?" he asked, though he knew she could not answer. "Where's your family?" As he carried her back toward his cabin, questions buzzed in his head like angry wasps. Who had been in that wagon? Why had they left a child behind? And why did those cut harnesses look like someone had freed the horses on purpose, as if they were running from something worse than mountain lions or bears? The snow fell harder now, covering their tracks and the child's trail. By the time he reached his cabin, the forest looked like it had been painted white. Whatever story the ground might have told was now hidden under winter's first blanket. Inside his one-room home, Ezra laid the girl on his narrow bed and built up the fire until the whole cabin glowed orange with warmth. He had no idea how to care for a sick child, but he knew about cold and fever from his trapping days. Hot water, warm blankets, and something to get her strength back. As he worked, heating water and finding clean cloth, the child began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open green as deep forest pools and fixed on his face with a look of pure terror. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice no louder than wind through grass. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. What had this child seen that made her afraid of a stranger who was trying to help? "Shh, you're safe now," Ezra said, keeping his voice gentle as he wrung out a cloth in warm water. The little girl watched his every move like a cornered animal ready to bolt. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Ezra." She said nothing, just pulled his big coat tighter around her small body. In the firelight, he could see her more clearly now. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she had the kind of face that belonged in a church painting, all innocence and light. But her eyes held shadows no child should carry. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into his wooden chair a safe distance from the bed. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. "Elizabeth. But most folks call me Lizzie." "Well, Miss Lizzie, you gave me quite a scare out there. What were you doing so far up the mountain?" Her face crumpled like paper thrown in a fire. "They said I had to go. Said I was bringing bad luck to everyone." Ezra felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Who said that?" "The people in town. After Mama got sick and died, fresh tears cut tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. They said the fever followed me around like a shadow. Said everywhere I went, people got sick and died too. That's not how sickness works, child. Fever comes and goes as it pleases. It's got nothing to do with little girls." But even as he said the words, Ezra understood what had happened. He had seen it before, during the war and after. When people got scared, they looked for someone to blame, someone small and helpless, who could not fight back. "They put me in the wagon with Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," Lizzie continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. "Said they were taking me to live with my aunt in Helena. But when we got up in the mountains, Mrs. Henderson started crying. She said she was sorry, but they couldn't take me all the way. Said her own children might catch whatever curse I was carrying." Ezra's hands clenched into fists. The idea of adults abandoning a child in the wilderness made his blood boil like water on a hot stove. "They cut the horses loose and left me the wagon," Lizzie whispered. "Mrs. Henderson gave me this." She pulled a small wooden cross from beneath his coat. The paint was worn away where small fingers had rubbed it smooth. She said to pray for forgiveness. "Forgiveness for what? You didn't do anything wrong." "I must have. Or else, why would they leave me to die?" The simple logic of it broke Ezra's heart. This child had spent who knows how long believing she deserved to be thrown away like spoiled meat. "Sometimes grown-ups make terrible mistakes," he said carefully. "Sometimes they're so scared they can't think straight. But that doesn't make their mistakes your fault." Lizzie studied his face as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Ezra looked at this small, damaged creature who had somehow survived alone in the wilderness, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he had thought was dead and buried years ago. "No," he said, surprised by how certain he sounded. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Not tonight, anyway." For the first time since he had found her, something like hope flickered in her green eyes. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, and Ezra ladled rabbit stew into a tin bowl. As she ate, he told her about his life on the mountain, the animals he trapped, the way the seasons changed the face of the land, how the stars looked different up here than they did down in the valleys. "Why do you live all alone?" she asked between spoonfuls of stew. Ezra was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with an iron rod. "Sometimes the world gets too loud," he finally said. "Too many people wanting too many things. Up here, It's just you and the mountain. The mountain doesn't lie or make promises it can't keep. Were people mean to you too? The innocent question cut deeper than she could know. Ezra thought about his old life, the wife who had left him for a man with better prospects, the business partners who had cheated him out of everything he owned, the friends who had turned their backs when he needed help most. Some were, he admitted, but that was a long time ago. Will you teach me how to live on the mountain? Lizzie asked suddenly. So I won't have to go back to town where people think I'm cursed? Ezra looked at her small, earnest face and felt something he had not experienced in 15 years of solitude. The need to protect another human being. This child had been thrown away by the world, just like he had been. Maybe they could figure out how to survive together. We'll see, he said gently. First, you need to get your strength back. Then we'll worry about what comes next. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and snow piled up against the windows. By morning, the trail down the mountain would be impassable until spring. Whatever decision he made about Lizzie would have to wait for warmer weather. As the fire burned low and the child drifted off to sleep, Ezra sat in his chair and watched the steady rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time in 15 years, his cabin did not feel empty. But in the back of his mind, a nagging worry grew like a storm cloud on the horizon. The people who had abandoned this child, would they be satisfied knowing she was probably dead? Or would they come looking to make sure their problem was solved forever? The scream that shattered the dawn silence came from inside the cabin, high and sharp like a wounded animal caught in a trap. Ezra bolted upright from his chair where he had dozed off, his hand reaching for his rifle before his eyes were fully open. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and frost covered the inside of the windows like silver lace. Lizzie thrashed on the bed, her small fists beating at invisible enemies. No, please, I didn't mean to. Don't leave me. Her fever had broken during the night, but now she fought demons only she could see. Hey there, easy now, Ezra said softly, approaching the bed like he would a spooked horse. You're having a bad dream. You're safe. Her green eyes snapped open, wild with terror. For a moment, she did not recognize him. Then memory flooded back, and she threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his shoulder. I dreamed they came back for me, she whispered. They said I wasn't allowed to live anywhere, not even up here. Ezra patted her tangled hair, feeling clumsy and uncertain. He had no experience comforting children. His own childhood had been short on comfort and long on hard lessons. But something about her desperate need called to a part of him he thought had died years ago. Dreams can't hurt you, he said. And nobody's coming up here in this snow. Look outside. The world beyond his windows had turned into a white wonderland overnight. Snow piled 3 feet deep against the cabin walls, and more fell in thick curtains that made it impossible to see past the nearest trees. The mountain had wrapped itself in winter's embrace, sealing them off from the world below. Are we trapped? Lizzie asked, wiping her nose on his coat sleeve. For now, but trapped isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it means safe. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine that surprised Ezra with its easy rhythm. He taught her to feed the fire without getting burned, showing her how to split kindling with a small hatchet he found in his tool shed. She learned to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead and how to stretch their food supplies by adding wild onions and pine nuts he had stored for winter. Why do you have so many books? She asked one afternoon, running her finger along the spines of the volumes that lined one wall of the cabin. Ezra looked up from the rabbit skin he was preparing. I used to be a teacher before I came to the mountains. It was the first time he had spoken about his past to anyone in 15 years. The words felt strange on his tongue, like a language he had almost forgotten. What did you teach? Reading, writing, numbers. How to think about big questions that don't have easy answers. Lizzie pulled down a book of poetry and opened it to a random page. I can read some, she said proudly. Mama taught me before she got sick. She said reading was like having friends who lived in your head. Your mama sounds like a smart woman. She was. She knew about plants that could heal sick people, and she could make bread that tasted like sunshine. Lizzie's voice grew quiet. After she died, nobody wanted to remember the good things about her. They only remembered that she got the fever. Ezra set down the rabbit skin and really looked at this child for the first time since he had found her. Beneath the dirt and fear, she had her mother's intelligence shining in her eyes. She was not just a burden dumped on his doorstep. She was a person with thoughts and dreams and a curiosity about the world that reminded him of his best students. "Would you like me to teach you things your mama didn't have time for?" he asked. Her face lit up like sunrise over the peaks. "Really? You'd do that? We've got all winter. Might as well put it to good use." And so their education began. Every morning after breakfast, they would sit at his rough wooden table, while Ezra taught her numbers and letters, geography and history. She soaked up knowledge like dry earth drinks rain, asking questions that made him think harder than he had in years. "If the world is round like you say," she asked one day, "why don't the people on the bottom fall off? What do you think holds them on?" She chewed on her pencil stub, thinking hard. Maybe falling is different depending on where you are? Maybe down changes? Ezra smiled. She was going to be trouble for any teacher who expected simple answers. But it was not just book learning that filled their days. He showed her how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to tell which way the wind would blow by watching the clouds. She learned to set snares for rabbits and to skin them without waste. Her small hands proved surprisingly skilled at mending clothes and preparing hides. In town, they said girls weren't supposed to know about hunting and trapping, she mentioned one evening as she carefully stitched a tear in his coat. "What do you think about that?" Ezra asked. "I think people in town say a lot of foolish things." He laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the cabin. When was the last time he had laughed? When was the last time he had felt happy? The realization hit him like a falling tree. Somewhere in the routine of teaching and caring for this abandoned child, his own wounds had started to heal. The bitter anger that had driven him to these mountains was melting away like snow in spring sunshine. But late at night, when Lizzie slept peacefully in his bed, and he dozed in his chair by the fire, darker thoughts crept in like wolves at the edge of the light. The people who had left her to die, would they be content thinking she was gone forever? Or would guilt eat at them until they had to know for sure? And what about the law? If anyone discovered he was keeping a child up here, would they believe his story about finding her abandoned? Or would they see an old hermit who had stolen a little girl for purposes too dark to imagine? One night in late November, as a blizzard raged outside their warm cabin, Lizzie looked up from the sock she was darning and asked the question he had been dreading. "When spring comes, will you take me back down to town?" Ezra stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. "Do you want to go back?" "No," she said quickly. "But I don't want to cause trouble for you either. People might say bad things about you keeping me here." "Let me worry about people," he said. "The question is what you want." She was quiet for so long he thought she had fallen asleep. Then, in a voice small but certain, she said, "I want to stay with you. I want to learn everything you can teach me. I want to belong somewhere." The words wrapped around his heart like warm hands around cold fingers. This child, this gift the mountain had delivered to his door, wanted to stay, wanted to be part of his life. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Come spring, we'll figure out how to make it legal and proper. But you're not going anywhere you don't want to go." Outside, the wind howled its approval, and snow continued to fall like a benediction. They were safe for now, wrapped in winter's protective arms. But both of them knew that spring would bring questions, and questions would bring people. People who might not understand that some things were worth fighting for. The stranger's tracks appeared in the snow like dark omens, leading straight toward Ezra's cabin through the morning mist. From his window, Ezra counted the prints, 2 men, maybe 3, moving with the careful steps of hunters tracking dangerous prey. His blood turned to ice water in his veins as he reached for his rifle. "Lizzie," he called softly, not taking his eyes off the tree line where the tracks disappeared. "Come away from the window. Now." She had been kneeling on his bed, watching icicles form along the roof edge. At the sharp tone in his voice, she scrambled down and pressed herself against the log wall beside the fireplace. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "Company coming. The kind that doesn't knock first." It had been 3 months since he had found her dying under that lightning-struck pine. 3 months of teaching her to read and write, to cook and hunt, to think and question everything. 3 months of watching her bloom like a wildflower in good soil, growing stronger and braver each day. 3 months of hoping the world would forget about one small girl lost in the wilderness. The hope died when he saw the first man step out of the forest. Even at a distance, Ezra recognized Jacob Henley from Bear Creek, a tall, thin man with the cold eyes of a snake and the kind of righteousness that justified any cruelty. Behind him came two others Ezra did not know, but their faces wore the same expression of grim purpose. "Elizabeth Morrison," Henley called out, his voice carrying across the snowy clearing like a gunshot. "We know you're in there, child. Come out now, and nobody has to get hurt." Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle. They knew her name. They knew exactly who they were looking for and where to find her. Someone in Bear Creek had been asking questions, putting pieces together, following rumors up the mountain. "What do they want?" Lizzie asked, her voice barely audible. "You," Ezra said grimly. "Stay down and stay quiet. Let me handle this." He opened the cabin door just wide enough to step outside, keeping the rifle ready but not obviously threatening. The morning air bit at his face like tiny knives, and his breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady as mountain stone, "you're a long way from town." "Not as far as we hoped," Henley replied, taking another step closer. "We've come for the girl, Caldwell, the one you took from that wagon back in October." "I didn't take anybody. I found a child left to die in the wilderness and did what any decent person would do." "Decent?" The word came out like a curse. "Decent would have been bringing her back to town where she belongs. Instead, you kept her up here like some kind of pet." The insult hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ezra felt his temper rise like steam from a kettle, but he kept his voice level. "She belongs where people won't abandon her to freeze to death." "That girl carries death wherever she goes," said one of the other men, a stocky fellow with nervous eyes. "My own brother died after she visited his shop. 3 children on Maple Street came down with fever right after she walked past their houses. She's cursed, I tell you. The only curse here is fear making good people act like monsters." Ezra shot back. "Monsters?" Henley's face twisted with anger. "We're trying to protect our families from a plague bringer. You're the one keeping a child up here for God knows what purpose." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Ezra saw where this was heading, 3 men against 1, with the law and public opinion on their side. They would paint him as something evil, something to be destroyed without question or mercy. "The child stays," he said quietly. "The child comes with us," Henley replied, "one way or another." Inside the cabin, Lizzie pressed her ear against the thick log wall, trying to make sense of the voices outside. She could not hear all the words, but the tone was clear enough. Angry men who wanted to take her away from the only safety she had known since her mother died. Her small hands found the wooden cross Mrs. Henderson had given her that terrible day in the mountains. She had kept it not because she believed in its power to protect her, but because it reminded her that even people who did bad things sometimes felt sorry afterward. But these men did not sound sorry. They sounded like the mob that had gathered outside her house the night after her mother's funeral, shouting about curses and demanding she be sent away before more people got sick. Through a crack between the logs, she could see Ezra standing in the doorway with his rifle, facing 3 men who had spread out to surround the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. They were going to hurt him. Because of her. Because he had chosen to save a cursed child instead of letting her die quietly in the woods. "I won't let them hurt you," she whispered to the empty cabin. "Not because of me." Before fear could stop her, Lizzie opened the cabin door and stepped outside into the bitter morning air. Her bare feet sank into snow that came up to her knees, but she barely felt the cold. "I'll come with you," she called out, her young voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Just leave Ezra alone." All 4 men turned to stare at her, this slip of a girl in a patched dress, standing knee-deep in snow with her chin raised like a queen facing her enemies. "Lizzie, no," Ezra said sharply. "Get back inside." "It's all right," she said, though her voice shook with cold and fear. "I know why they're here. They think I killed all those people with my curse. They think if I go away, nobody else will die." "Smart girl," Henley said with satisfaction. "Smarter than the fool who's been hiding you up here. But I have one question," Lizzie continued, taking another step toward the men. "If I'm so dangerous, why aren't you afraid to get close to me? Why aren't you worried about catching my curse?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The stocky man took an unconscious step backward, and even Henley's confident expression flickered for a moment. "Because," said a new voice from the forest behind them, "there is no curse. There never was." Dr. Margaret Whitman emerged from the trees like an angel of judgment, her medical bag in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other. Her gray hair was covered with snow, and her usually kind eyes blazed with righteous fury. "Hello, Jacob," she said pleasantly. "Fancy meeting you up here. Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always did prefer hunting things that couldn't fight back." Henley's face went pale as fresh snow. "Dr. Whitman, this is no concern of yours." "Oh, but it is," she replied, moving to stand beside Ezra with her rifle ready. "You see, I've spent the winter doing something you never bothered with, investigating what really caused that fever outbreak in Bear Creek." The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as her words sank in. Even the wind held its breath, waiting to hear what came next. "And what I found," Dr. Whitman continued, her voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's blade, "is going to make you wish you had never climbed this mountain." The leather satchel hit the snow with a thud that seemed to echo off the mountain peaks, spilling papers and photographs across the white ground like autumn leaves scattered by wind. Dr. Whitman's face was granite hard as she watched the three men scramble to collect the damning evidence before it could blow away in the mountain breeze. "Don't bother," she said coldly. "I have copies of everything back in town, including the water tests that prove exactly where that fever came from." Jacob Henley's face had gone from pale to green, like a man watching his own execution. "You don't know what you're talking about, old woman. That girl," Dr. Whitman interrupted, "is the only honest witness to what really happened, which is why you're so desperate to make sure she never talks." Ezra kept his rifle trained on the three men while his mind raced to catch up. Water tests? Witnesses? What had the doctor discovered during her winter investigation? "Tell them, Jacob," Dr. Whitman continued, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "Tell them about the mine tailings you and your business partners dumped in Willow Creek. Tell them about the mercury and lead that poisoned the town's water supply." The stocky man, the one who had blamed Lizzie for his brother's death, suddenly looked like he wanted to run back down the mountain as fast as his legs could carry him. "You said the tests would never find anything," he hissed at Henley. "You said it was too diluted." "Shut up, Reynolds," Henley snapped, but the damage was done. The truth was spilling out like water through a broken dam. "Thomas Reynolds," Dr. Whitman said thoughtfully, "co-owner of the Bear Creek Silver Company, the same company that's been illegally dumping mining waste upstream from the town for the past 2 years. Lizzie stepped closer to Ezra, her small hand finding his free one. Even at 6 years old, she could sense the dangerous currents swirling around them. These men had not just abandoned her, they had killed people. Her mother, the children on Maple Street, Reynolds' own brother, all dead because of poison in the water, not because of any curse. Elizabeth Morrison's mother was a laundress. Dr. Whitman continued relentlessly. She drew water directly from Willow Creek every day for her work. When she started getting sick, she was smart enough to make the connection. She was asking questions, testing the water herself, getting ready to expose what you had done. "She was making trouble," Reynolds said desperately, "spreading lies about the mining company. We couldn't let her save the town?" Ezra asked, his voice deadly quiet. "So you killed her with poison and then blamed her daughter when other people started dying too?" "It wasn't supposed to go that far." The third man spoke for the first time, his voice shaking. "We just needed to move the operation somewhere else. But then more people got sick, and folks started looking for someone to blame. And a 6-year-old orphan made the perfect target," Dr. Whitman finished. "Especially after you spread rumors about her being cursed. Much easier than admitting you had murdered half the town for mining profits." The mountain silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Snow began falling again, fat flakes that stuck to everyone's hair and shoulders. In the distance, a hawk cried out, the sound sharp and lonely in the thin air. "What do you want?" Henley asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Justice," Dr. Whitman said simply. "You're going to ride back down to Bear Creek and confess everything to Marshall Davis. You're going to pay for the funerals of everyone who died from your poison. And you're going to make sure everyone in town knows that Lizzie Morrison never hurt a soul." "And if we don't?" Dr. Whitman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I send copies of all my evidence to the territorial governor, the federal marshal in Helena, and every newspaper between here and Denver. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if they only hang you." Reynolds was openly weeping now, tears freezing on his cheeks in the bitter cold. My wife. My children. They'll be ruined. Your children will live, Lizzie said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the man's sobs. Mine won't. My mama won't. All those people you killed won't. The simple truth of it hit like a physical blow. Here was a child who had lost everything, her mother, her home, her entire world because of their greed and cowardice. And still she stood there with more dignity than all 3 grown men combined. The girl comes with us, Henley said desperately, making one last grab for control. She's still a witness. We can't just leave her up here to spread stories. The girl stays exactly where she wants to stay, Ezra said, raising his rifle. And if you take one step toward her, I'll put a bullet in you myself. You can't keep her, Reynolds protested. You're not family. You're not even married. The law won't. The law will do exactly what I tell it to do, Dr. Song, Whitman interrupted. Because I'm the one with evidence of your crimes. Make me angry. And I might forget to mention how cooperative you were when you finally confessed. The standoff stretched on. 4 adults with guns facing each other across a small clearing, while a child stood at the center of it all. The stakes had never been higher, but somehow the outcome felt inevitable. Truth had a weight that lies could never match, and the truth was on Lizzie's side. Finally, Henley lowered his rifle. This isn't over. Oh, but it is, Dr. Whitman said cheerfully. You lost the moment you decided to blame a child for your own crimes. Everything else is just details. As the 3 men trudged away through the snow, their shoulders bent with defeat, Lizzie looked up at Ezra with wonder in her green eyes. They really thought I killed all those people? Fear makes people stupid, Ezra said, pulling her close. And guilt makes them desperate. Will they really confess? Or will they try to run away? Dr. Whitman shouldered her rifle and picked up her scattered papers. They'll confess. Men like that are cowards at heart. When faced with a choice between admitting their mistakes and facing something worse, they always choose confession. But as she spoke, a nagging doubt crept into her mind. Jacob Henley had not become one of the most powerful men in Bear Creek by giving up easily. A cornered animal was always most dangerous, and they had just backed him into a very tight corner indeed. We should be ready for trouble, she said quietly to Ezra. This may not be the end of it. Ezra nodded grimly, watching the 3 figures disappear into the forest. The truth was out now, but truth and justice were not always the same thing. And powerful men with secrets to protect had been known to do terrible things when their backs were against the wall. The marshal's badge caught the firelight like a warning as Deputy Carl Morrison stepped into the warm cabin, his boots leaving puddles of melted snow on the wooden floor. Behind him came 2 more men. One Ezra recognized as a federal investigator from Helena, the other a complete stranger with cold eyes and expensive clothes. Mr. Caldwell, Deputy Morrison said formally, though his voice carried an undercurrent of nervousness. I'm here on official business regarding the child Elizabeth Morrison. Lizzie looked up from the book she was reading by the fire, her face going pale at the sight of uniformed men in their safe haven. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation with Henley and his partners, 2 weeks of hoping the nightmare was finally over. What kind of official business? Ezra asked, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate calm. The federal investigator stepped forward, his voice crisp and professional. I'm Agent Parker from the Territorial Office. We've received concerning reports about the circumstances of this child's residence here. What kind of reports? Dr. Whitman demanded from her chair near the window. She had been staying with them since the confrontation, partly for protection, and partly to help care for Lizzie while the legal questions got sorted out. Reports suggesting Mr. Caldwell may have taken this child under questionable circumstances, the stranger in expensive clothes said smoothly. I represent certain interests in Bear Creek who are concerned about her welfare. Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. Henley had not given up after all. Instead of confessing to his crimes, he had turned the tables, painting Ezra as the criminal and himself as a concerned citizen, trying to rescue an innocent child. What interests? Dr. Whitman asked sharply. The Bear Creek Town Council, the man replied. My name is Lawrence Blackwood, attorney at law. My clients are deeply disturbed by allegations that a known hermit has been keeping a young girl isolated in the wilderness for months. Known hermit? Ezra repeated, anger building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Come now, Mr. Caldwell. You've lived alone on this mountain for 15 years. avoiding human contact, refusing to participate in civilized society. When a child goes missing and turns up in your cabin months later, he spread his hands as if the conclusion was obvious. The child wasn't missing, Dr. Whitman snapped. She was abandoned by the very people who are now claiming to be concerned about her welfare. So you say, Agent Parker replied, but we have sworn statements from 3 upstanding citizens of Bear Creek saying they searched for this child for weeks after she disappeared from a wagon accident. They claim to have evidence that Mr. Caldwell may have been involved in her disappearance. Lizzie stood up from her chair, the book falling forgotten to the floor. That's not true, she said, her young voice shaking with anger. They left me to die. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson cut the horses loose and rode away. They said I was cursed and they couldn't take me to Helena. The testimony of a traumatized child is hardly reliable evidence, Blackwood said dismissively, especially one who has been isolated with an adult male for months, possibly subjected to influences that might affect her memory. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Ezra felt his hands clench into fists, and it took every ounce of self-control he possessed not to throw this snake of a lawyer bodily out of his cabin. Are you accusing me of hurting this child? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. I'm simply noting that the situation raises questions, Blackwood replied smoothly. Questions that can only be answered by removing the child from this environment and placing her somewhere safe while a proper investigation is conducted. She is safe, Ezra said firmly. Safer than she ever was in Bear Creek. Safe? Agent Parker looked around the one-room cabin with obvious disapproval. A 6-year-old girl living alone in the wilderness with an unmarried man, sleeping in the same room, eating the same food, isolated from all civilizing influences, learning to read and write. Dr. Whitman interjected, learning mathematics and history and natural science, learning skills that will help her survive in the world, learning from 2 adults who actually care about her welfare, instead of using her as a scapegoat for their own crimes. Crimes? Deputy Morrison looked confused. What crimes? Dr. Whitman started to speak, but Blackwood cut her off. Dr. Whitman has been spreading wild theories about mining operations and water contamination. Completely unsubstantiated allegations designed to distract from the real issue here. Unsubstantiated? Dr. Whitman pulled out a thick folder of papers. I have water samples, medical records, death certificates, and testimony from, all of which will be examined in due time, Agent Parker said dismissively. But right now, our immediate concern is the welfare of this child. Lizzie stepped closer to Ezra, her small hand finding his. I don't want to go back to town, she said quietly. Please don't make me go back there. The child's wants are not the primary consideration here, Blackwood said coldly. What matters is what's best for her moral and educational development. And that clearly cannot happen in this environment. Ezra looked down at Lizzie's frightened face and felt something break inside his chest. After all they had been through together, after all the progress she had made, these men wanted to drag her back to the very people who had tried to kill her. She's not going anywhere, he said firmly. Agent Parker's hand moved to the gun at his hip. Mr. Caldwell, I'm trying to handle this in a civilized manner. Don't force me to use official authority. What authority? Dr. Whitman demanded, standing up with fire in her eyes. You have no legal right to remove this child without cause, and you certainly have no right to threaten a man for protecting her. I have a court order, Blackwood said smugly, pulling a document from his coat. Signed by Judge Harrison in Bear Creek, authorizing the removal of Elizabeth Morrison from inappropriate living conditions, pending a full investigation. The paper crackled in the sudden silence. Outside, the wind moaned through the pine trees like a morning song. Everything they had built together, everything they had hoped for, was about to be destroyed by men with badges and legal papers. Judge Harrison? Dr. Whitman said slowly. The same Judge Harrison who owns shares in the Bear Creek Silver Company? Blackwood's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Judge Harrison is a respected member of the community who has every reason to make sure certain evidence never sees the light of day, Dr. Whitman finished. How convenient that he's suddenly so concerned about child welfare. Agent Parker looked uncertain for the first time since entering the cabin. What evidence are you talking about, Doctor? Evidence that will hang your clients if it ever reaches an honest court, she replied. Evidence that proves they murdered dozens of people including this child's mother, by poisoning the town's water supply. That's slander, Blackwood said quickly. Wild accusations from a woman who has spent her entire career saving lives, Ezra interrupted. Unlike your clients, who seem to specialize in destroying them. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. 6 adults faced off over the fate of one small girl, each side convinced they were fighting for what was right. But only one side was willing to sacrifice an innocent child to protect their own interests. Gentlemen, Dr. Whitman said quietly, I suggest you reconsider your position, because if you take this child back to Bear Creek, if you hand her over to the very people who tried to murder her, then you become accessories to attempted murder. And if anything happens to her, Ezra added, his voice carrying the promise of violence, I will hold each of you personally responsible. Agent Parker looked from the court order to Lizzie's terrified face to the grim determination in Ezra's eyes. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to realize that this was not a simple case of child welfare. Perhaps, he said slowly, we should hear more about this evidence before proceeding. The explosion that shook the valley floor sent birds screaming from their roosts and started an avalanche on the far ridge that rumbled like distant thunder. From his position on the rocky outcrop above Bear Creek, Ezra watched through his spyglass as orange flames licked at what had once been the Bear Creek Silver Company's main office building. They're destroying the evidence, Agent Parker said grimly, lowering his own field glasses. 3 days had passed since Dr. Whitman had laid out her case in the cabin. 3 days of tense negotiations and careful planning. Now their worst fears were coming true. Below them in the valley, tiny figures ran like ants around the burning building. Even from this distance, Ezra could make out Jacob Henley directing the chaos, his arm gesturing wildly as he shouted orders to the bucket brigade that was making a half-hearted attempt to fight the flames. Not if I can help it, Dr. Whitman muttered, checking the contents of her medical bag one more time. Hidden beneath the bandages and medicine bottles were glass vials of water samples and copies of the most damning documents. They can burn the building, but they can't burn the truth. Deputy Morrison shifted nervously beside them, still trying to understand how a simple child custody case had turned into something involving arson and murder. Shouldn't we be down there helping fight the fire? That fire was set on purpose, Agent Parker replied. Going down there now would be walking into a trap. Henley knows we have evidence against him. He's desperate enough to do anything to stop us. Lizzie pressed closer to Ezra's side, her small body trembling despite the warm spring sunshine. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of adult conversations she only half understood, but she knew the men who had abandoned her were trying to hurt the people who had saved her. Are they going to take me away? She whispered. Not if I have anything to say about it, Ezra replied, but his voice carried a weight of uncertainty that made her stomach twist with fear. The truth was, their legal position remained shaky at best. Yes, Dr. Whitman had evidence of the mining company's crimes. Yes, they could prove that Lizzie had been abandoned and left to die. But proving those things in court required judges and juries who cared more about justice than protecting their own interests. And, in a territory where mining money bought influence like water bought whiskey, finding such people was harder than finding gold in a played-out claim. Movement on the South Road, Agent Parker announced, pointing toward a dust cloud rising from the direction of Helena. Looks like a big group, maybe 20 riders. Ezra adjusted his spyglass and felt his heart sink. At the head of the approaching column rode a man in a black suit, with silver-trimmed Judge Harrison himself, along with what looked like half the territorial militia. They're not taking any chances this time, he said quietly. Dr. Whitman's face went pale as she recognized some of the riders through her own field glasses. That's not just the militia. I see at least 3 men from the mining company board, 2 more territorial judges, and, she paused, adjusting the focus, and Marshal Thompson from the federal office. The same Marshal Thompson who owes his appointment to mining interests? Agent Parker asked bitterly. The very same. The trap was closing around them like the jaws of a steel bear trap. Below in the valley, the fire was already dying down, its work of destruction complete. Above on the mountain, a small group of people who knew the truth found themselves facing an army of those who preferred profitable lies. We could run, Deputy Morrison suggested quietly. Take the girl and head for the Canadian border. Start fresh somewhere they'll never find us. Running makes us look guilty, Agent Parker replied. And it doesn't help all the people in Bear Creek who are still drinking poisoned water. Besides, Lizzie said unexpectedly, her young voice carrying a determination that surprised all the adults, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding. If they want to take me, they'll have to explain why in front of everyone. Ezra looked down at her with something like pride mixing with his fear. This child who had been thrown away like garbage had grown into someone willing to stand up for herself, even against impossible odds. She's right, Dr. Whitman said slowly. We make our stand here, in the open, where everyone can see what's really happening. Sometimes the best defense is making sure the whole world is watching. Agent Parker nodded grimly. Then we'd better get down there before they can set up their version of events. Once Judge Harrison starts talking, the truth becomes whatever he says it is. The ride down the mountain felt like descending into battle. The spring wind carried the smell of smoke and burned paper, along with something else, the metallic scent of fear and desperation that came when powerful people felt their secrets slipping away. As they approached the outskirts of Bear Creek, Ezra could see crowds gathering in the streets. Word of the confrontation had spread through the small community like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers and concerned citizens from every corner of the valley. Look at all those people, Lizzie said wonderingly. They're all here because of me? They're here because of what you represent, Dr. Whitman replied. The truth that someone tried very hard to bury. But as they rode closer, Ezra began to notice something troubling about the crowd. Most of the faces turned toward them carried expressions of suspicion and anger, not curiosity. Henley and his partners had been busy during the past few days, spreading their version of events to anyone who would listen. Child stealer, someone shouted from the gathered crowd. Give us back our girl. Murderer, came another voice. What did you do to her real parents? The accusations hit like physical blows. Here were people who had stood by silently while a 6-year-old was abandoned to die, now painting themselves as her protectors and him as the villain. Don't listen to them, Agent Parker said quietly. They're scared and confused. Once they hear the real story, his words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bullet kicked up dirt just inches from their horses' hooves, causing the animals to rear and dance sideways in panic. That's close enough. Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the town square. He sat on his horse like a king on his throne, surrounded by armed men whose loyalty had been bought and paid for. Caldwell, you are under arrest for kidnapping, child endangerment, and interfering with a lawful investigation. What investigation? Dr. Whitman called back. The one where you destroy evidence and threaten witnesses? Dr. Whitman, the judge replied with cold politeness, you are also under arrest for practicing medicine without proper territorial licensing and for spreading false information designed to cause public panic. The charges were ridiculous, but they served their purpose. In a territory where judges had almost unlimited power, ridiculous charges could still put innocent people in prison while guilty ones walked free. And the child, Judge Harrison continued, his gaze settling on Lizzie like a hawk eyeing a mouse, will be placed in protective custody until suitable arrangements can be made for her care. No. Lizzie's voice rang out clear and strong across the square. I won't go with you. You're the bad people. You killed my mama and tried to kill me too. A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. Some faces showed confusion, others anger, but a few, just a few, began to look troubled, as if they were hearing something that made uncomfortable sense. Judge Harrison's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. The child has clearly been corrupted by her captors. She needs proper care and guidance to overcome the lies she's been told. But before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Actually, Your Honor, I think you're the one who's been telling lies. The woman who stepped out of the crowd moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years fighting battles that others were afraid to face. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dark dress was travel-stained from hard riding. But her eyes blazed with the fire of absolute moral certainty. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the silent square. Elizabeth's aunt from Helena, the one she was supposedly being taken to visit when she disappeared. A shocked gasp ran through the crowd. Judge Harrison's face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. and Jacob Henley actually swayed in his saddle as if he might faint. "That's impossible," Henley stammered. "We sent word to you months ago about the child's situation. You never responded." "Because I never received any word," Catherine Morrison replied calmly. "Funny how letters sometimes get lost when powerful men don't want them delivered. But eventually, word reached me through other channels. Word about a mining company that's been poisoning my sister's town and blaming the deaths on a 6-year-old child." She walked forward through the parting crowd until she stood directly beneath Judge Harrison's horse, her small frame somehow dominating the much larger man through sheer force of will. "I've spent the past 2 months investigating what really happened to my sister and her daughter, talking to survivors, testing water samples, reading medical records that somehow didn't make it into official reports." She pulled out a thick folder of papers. "Would you like to see what I found, Your Honor?" The judge's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing that something momentous was happening but not quite understanding what. "You have no authority here," he finally managed. "This is a territorial matter, not—" "Actually, she has all the authority she needs." Marshal David Santos rode into the square at the head of a column of federal investigators, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Unlike the territorial militia surrounding Judge Harrison, these men wore the crisp uniforms and serious expressions of lawmen who couldn't be bought. Mrs. Morrison's investigation was conducted under federal authority. Marshal Santos continued, dismounting and walking over to stand beside Catherine. "As of this morning, the territorial government has been relieved of jurisdiction in this matter, pending a complete investigation of corruption charges." Judge Harrison's face went purple with rage. "You have no right. This is my territory. My jurisdiction." "Was your jurisdiction," Marshal Santos corrected, "until you started destroying evidence and threatening federal witnesses. Now it's mine." The crowd exploded into confused chatter as the full implications sank in. The untouchable men who had ruled Bear Creek through money and intimidation were suddenly facing judgment from authorities they couldn't control or bribe. Catherine Morrison walked over to where Lizzie sat on her horse beside Ezra, tears streaming down both their faces. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you." "Are you really my mama's sister?" Lizzie whispered. "I really am. And you look just like she did when she was your age. Same green eyes, same stubborn chin, same way of standing up to bullies even when they're bigger than you are." Lizzie slipped down from the horse and threw her arms around her aunt, finally allowing herself to believe that the nightmare might really be over. "They said I killed her. They said I was cursed and made people sick." "The only curse in this town was greed," Catherine replied, holding her tight. "Men who cared more about money than human lives. But that curse is about to be broken." Marshal Santos was already moving through the crowd, placing Jacob Henley and his partners under arrest, while his deputies secured the evidence that Dr. Whitman had carefully preserved. Judge Harrison sat on his horse like a statue, watching his corrupt empire crumble around him. "What about Ezra?" Lizzie asked, turning to look at the mountain man who had saved her life and given her a family when she had nothing left. "He's not in trouble, is he?" Catherine Morrison followed her gaze to where Ezra sat quietly on his horse, looking like a man who wasn't sure what role he was supposed to play in this new reality. "Mr. Caldwell," she called out, "I understand I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my niece's life when the people who should have protected her threw her away like garbage." Ezra climbed down from his horse and approached them cautiously. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You did what very few people would have the courage to do. You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. You gave her a family when she had lost everything." "So, what happens now?" Dr. Whitman asked, joining the conversation. "Lizzie has family who wants her, but she also has a life on the mountain with Ezra." It was the question everyone had been avoiding, the choice that would determine not just Lizzie's future, but the futures of all the people who had come to love her. Catherine Morrison looked at her niece's face, then at Ezra's, and seemed to understand something that the adults around her had missed. "Elizabeth," she said gently, "you have 2 homes now. You have me and Helena, where you can go to school and learn about the world beyond these mountains. And you have Ezra on Copper Ridge, where you can learn about strength and independence and what it means to survive on your own terms." "I can have both?" Lizzie asked wonderingly. "If that's what you want. Summers on the mountain, Winters in town. The best of both worlds, if you're brave enough to take it. Lizzie looked from her aunt to Ezra and back again, seeing not a choice between two different lives but a chance to build something entirely new. A family that wasn't defined by blood or law but by love and choice. And the bonds forged in hardship. Yes, she said simply. That's what I want. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the people of Bear Creek began to understand that they had witnessed something remarkable. Not just the fall of corrupt men, or the solving of old crimes, but the birth of a new kind of family, one built on choice rather than circumstance, on love rather than law. Ezra Caldwell, the hermit of Copper Ridge, would never be alone again. Dr. Margaret Whitman found her calling running a medical clinic that served both the mountain communities and the growing town below. And Elizabeth Morrison, no longer the cursed child but simply Lizzie, would grow up knowing that she belonged exactly where she chose to be. The mountain had taught them all the same lesson. That family isn't about the circumstances of your birth, but about the people who choose to stand beside you when the world gets dark and cold. Some gifts come wrapped in hardship, delivered by the very wilderness that seems most unforgiving. And sometimes, the people society throws away are exactly the ones who end up saving everyone else.